Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight. Earlier this week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a United Nations working group, issued a report that said, quote, "Climate change is code red for humanity." So tonight and going forward, we will devote an In Focus discussion once a month to keep you informed on this topic. Kicking off our conversation first is Professor Robert Davies, who is with the Department of Physics and Ecology Center at Utah State University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'd like to begin with the IPCC report released this week. Can you share what was discussed in the report and what stood out to you?
Right. So first, let me say that this is the sixth installment of this kind of report taking place over the last 30 years. And what they released yesterday was the first volume. There are two more volumes coming in the winter and spring. So this particular report that was released yesterday just looks at the data of what exactly is happening to our climate system, why, and what can we expect in the future. And the reports that are coming, we'll talk in the winter and spring, we'll talk more about mitigating and adapting to these changes as well. And I will say that what stood out to me is, these are huge efforts. So a couple of hundred authors for this volume, looking at more than 14,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies, similar to the previous 5 editions of this over the last 30 years. And really, there's almost nothing new in this report in terms of the basic science of what we understand, which is that we're warming. It's because of humans, principally from the emission of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, and that it's disrupting the entire planetary climate system, and it carries with it extreme risks for us. So that's what the report says.
Now, Professor, tone was an important aspect of this report. Do you think the IPCC maybe needs to be more forceful in its language?
Well, so let me say that the one thing that the data showed this time that is different than previous reports is that the impacts that we're seeing from the global warming that we've induced so far, the climate changes and the impacts to both natural systems and human systems, are happening bigger and faster than were expected even 10 years ago. And as a result, everything that this report says is being said louder, as you implied with your notion about the tone. And I would say it's getting difficult for the tone, I would say, to get any stronger. The authors, the people releasing the report, even in the report itself, uses terms like, as you said, code red, emergency. It is unequivocal that we have very little time to meaningfully address this challenge before we can expect dramatically increased impacts from what we've already seen. So the tone is appropriate, and if anything, yes, could be stronger. But you have to remember, and I'll add one more thing, this is in scientific circles considered a very conservative report. Pretty much everything in it has to be approved line by 195 different governments. And so given that this is such a conservative report, and the fact that the tone is so crystal clear is really quite extraordinary.
Now, the report seemed to acknowledge that the planet's average temperature is incredibly close to climb 1.5 degrees in the near future. At face value, it doesn't really seem very significant, but on a grander scale of things, does that have a bigger implication?
Right, so let's make sure we understand that number. That's 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise, which if you double that is about how much in Fahrenheit we get since, say, the end of the 19th century. And of that, we have now already warmed a little more than 1 degree. So we're 1.1 degrees on our way to the 1.5 that you discussed. And that 1.5 has been identified as a red line based on the impacts that we've already seen for the amount of temperature change that we've had. That 1.5 number is expected now. That's the one we don't want to cross, and that's what they're really focusing on.
Now, what would happen with the 2-degree rise, which is forecast by the end of the century?
Well, so let's take a look at what's already happened here in Utah just for a 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature. We've had a dramatic shift in extremes in some cases, certainly heat extremes. And I'll just give you one example for Utah. in the entire 20th century, Tooele, for example, and this is representative of the entire state, in the entire 20th century, Tooele saw just 66 days above 100 degrees. In the first 10 years of this century, they saw 94 such days. And so it's not just this rise in average temperatures of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees Celsius doesn't sound like much, but it's the additional changes that get driven by that change. So changes in precipitation, in storm patterns, in droughts, in intensities and frequency, and all of those things. And I just gave you one example with Tooele. That's just with 1 degree Celsius of rise. At 1.5 degrees, we can expect to see quite a bit more impact. And this 2 degree line, a special report came out from the same group, the IPCC, 2 years ago, and said, look, we really don't want to get to 2 degrees. The difference between, for example, 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees for coral reefs is at 2 degrees, the marine biologists tell us we can expect to lose all of Earth's coral reefs. This is home to 25% of the ocean species. 1 to 2 billion people on the planet get their primary protein from the ocean. So you can start to see the extreme impacts once we start to hit 2 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, we have to act fast. You've been hearing from Professor Robert Davies, who is with the Department of Physics and Ecology Center at Utah State University. Professor, thank you for joining us tonight to help us dive into this report.
You're welcome.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on climate change, Code Red. We turn now to the politics surrounding climate change. Up next in our conversation is Professor Juliet Carlisle, who is part of the Department of Political Science, as well as the Environmental and Sustainability Studies program at the University of Utah. Professor, welcome back to the show. Let's talk about the human infrastructure bill that was passed by the U.S. Senate through the budget reconciliation process. $3.5 trillion. How much of that do you think will actually go towards climate change?
It is a big spending bill. It's a big budget, and a lot of programs will benefit. It's one of the biggest spending bills in 60 years for our social safety net, and about 36 billion of that 3.5 trillion is slated for climate change. That includes about 10 billion for clean energy, 7 billion for research by NOAA, 1.4 billion for environmental justice, and about 4 billion for water infrastructure, among other things.
Professor, what is the process for that money to get allocated?
So the process to get allocated, or spending the money, is really a process that will start at the federal government. It will be allocated to different departments and programs within federal agencies. And usually what we see with spending at the federal level is that there are grants that allow for states and localities, even nonprofit groups and academic research, to benefit from that money, to apply or to create programs to carry out the goals associated with allocated funds or money that is slated for particular goals and objectives.
Professor, how could the state of Utah see some of this funding?
The state of Utah, like any other state, has a shot at receiving a lot of the money. Some of the money is slated for emergencies, so climate emergency, droughts or floods, for example. And so if there is something that arises and a program needs expansion, the state of Utah or localities within the state certainly are available to pursue money. But again, as I said, like nonprofits and academic research, so we have several universities in the state that could very well see a lot of this money filtered down through research that they do to fund not only academics but students as well, and innovation for companies that might be trying to innovate when it comes to clean energy or electric car vehicles. So there's a lot of opportunity for people in the state and the state itself to benefit from this budget.
Now, the budget process seemed to be the only way to get this funding out. Do you think that there will be a will or even a possibility that the U.S. government could fund more to combat climate change anytime soon?
It's an interesting question. I mean, there's the theoretical answer to that, which is certainly, right? We know that every year there's a budget that comes due, and so next year's budget could easily see something like that. We also know that legislators can spearhead policy and push that through Congress, or activists can demand and compel legislators to act. But the reality is that this might be one of the last times we could see such an expansive bill for climate change, the politics of which, if we think about the next election, there are Democrats that are in vulnerable districts, and their support for this bill might jeopardize their vote return, the chances of re-election during the next election. And so, yeah, there's politics at play always, and so there's a difference between what we can theoretically do and what realistically can happen.
Feels like everything is being politicized these days.
Yes.
Professor, what are your thoughts on the notion that government shouldn't be spending money like this on climate change, that the innovation should come from business and the market?
Yeah, well, we've known for decades about climate change, and the opportunity for answers and responses and creating solutions to the problem haven't come. And so really when we think about it from a political perspective, we think of this as a classic collective action problem. We need the enforcement or the incentive of a federal government to compel action, to incentivize action, to create the opportunity for innovation. We have seen that a lot of industries, in particular the oil industry, has been very reluctant, even going so far as to provide misinformation about their role in climate change. And then I should also add, I think it's really important to underscore the fact that not acting costs money as well. We spend a great deal of money already on problems that are associated with the effects of climate change. Again, wildfires, floods, droughts, hurricanes, all of these weather events have a significant cost to society, and they will only continue to increase in cost. And so it's important that we invest to remedy and deal with some of these consequences before they get even more serious.
Right, and spending the money to be preventative, it'll save us from being responsive in the near future. Yeah. You've been hearing from Professor Juliet Carlisle, who is part of the Department of Political Science, as well as the Environmental and Sustainability Studies program at the University of Utah. Professor, thank you for coming back on the show tonight, and thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on climate change, Code Red. For this segment, we turn to something that is near and dear to Utah, the ski industry. Rounding out our conversation tonight is Professor Patrick Belmont, who is the Department Head of Watershed Sciences at Utah State University. Professor, thanks for joining us tonight. We'd like to start with that report from July of this year, saying that historical data indicates that ski resorts are warming faster than global averages, and that will probably happen for the foreseeable future. What else can you tell us about that study?
Well, this is a study that was driven by some graduate students that came to myself and a social scientist here at Utah State, Courtney Flint. And they said, we want to understand how climate change is impacting ski resorts throughout Utah and how they're dealing with it. And so we pulled data that's specific to ski resorts all throughout the state, all 14 ski resorts that we have here. And we interviewed as many of them as we could. And there were some interesting findings. Much of it was right along the lines of what probably many of us have already observed. We're seeing shorter seasons, we're seeing less snow, we're seeing poorer quality snow. And the data in the study certainly bore that out. Historically, snowpack throughout Utah has declined something on the order of 20 to 40% in a lot of places. And we're getting considerably wetter snow, so less of that great Utah powder that we're famous for.
Yeah, that is so concerning, especially for Utah, which was once known as the greatest snow on Earth. Professor, is this an altitude thing? Like, are winter sports affected across the globe?
Well, it's very much a global phenomenon, certainly. Higher elevations and higher latitudes are warming faster. And the report that came out on Monday, this big report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, laid that out in great detail. I mean, that's very predictable that higher elevation and higher latitude places will warm more quickly. So yes, winter sports are being affected all around the world.
So does snowmaking make an impact at all? I know that our resorts have been adding to the snowpack artificially for years now.
You know, that's one of the things that surprised me the most coming out of this study, because that's, of course, what I thought as well, is that we'll be able to make snow for a much longer period of time. And, you know, that's not turning out to be the case. That was one of the most rapidly declining things that we saw in the study at all 14 ski resorts, is the number of days that they're able to make snow. It has to be a fair bit below freezing to make snow. And the number of days that it gets that cold is dwindling quickly historically, and it's expected to dwindle even more quickly in the near future.
Yeah, as if COVID didn't impact the ski resorts enough, now we have climate change as well. Professor, in a larger sense, what does this lack of snowfall mean for people who live along the Wasatch Corridor?
Well, skiing is part of our identity here in Utah, and for some people it's a way of life. It's certainly something we really value here. And it's a big part of our economy. It's about $2 billion per year it adds to Utah's economy. But in another way, it's also a luxury. It's a recreational thing. Not many people are skiing for their survival. The bigger issue in all of this is that we get 90 to 95% of our water from our snowpack, right? So it's not like every year is going to be as bad of a drought as we're seeing this year, but droughts will become increasingly common and more severe. That means more wildfire. That means less water is going to be available, lower levels in our reservoirs, lower levels in the Great Salt Lake. That means more dust. So it's a lot of different implications coming from this observation of much lower snowpack. How bad will it get? Well, that's really up to us to decide. The key is getting the fossil fuels turned off as quickly as we can.
It's all a ripple effect, it seems like. Professor, are there any predictions for what our 2021 winter will look like?
There are some forecasts. The National Weather Service does a long-term forecast, and they're predicting an above average temperature this winter, which is pretty easily predicted. We've been seeing that now for a while. Every year is warmer than the last. But they're not making any firm predictions about the amount of precipitation. That's a really difficult thing to predict this far out. The longer term trends suggest that we're coming out of some wetter years, and we're going into what's likely to be a couple of drier years here. And so it very well could be as dry or drier than it was this last winter.
Professor, we have about a minute left. The state of Utah will be bidding on the Winter Olympics that will occur sometime in the next decade. What do you think those Winter Games will look like?
A great question. It's hard to know. You know, I'm not worried about there being snow on at least some slopes, but certainly the quality is going to be questionable. It really depends on what kind of action we take right now. We have a very short period of time to turn this around and get the fossil fuels turned off. The Utah State Legislature funded a study to develop a roadmap for the state. We have a great roadmap that the Ken Gardner Institute developed, but we really haven't been following it yet. We really haven't made any progress on that roadmap. And I think what this and future Winter Olympics are going to look like is going to really depend on us taking action, not just talking.
All right, you've been hearing from Professor Patrick Belmont, the Department Head of Watershed Sciences at Utah State University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us and for your insight tonight.
Thank you for covering me.
And don't forget, we'd love to hear from you about the show. We invite you to join our Facebook group by searching for ABC4 In Focus, or you can send us an email at infocus@abc4.com.